For how much fun video games can be, why is it sometimes so difficult to get ourselves to play certain games? This is a question I've had for a long time, but it's been on my mind even more recently. We are quickly approaching the 1-year anniversary of Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. And despite my 125 odd hours with the game, this title stands unfinished in my library. I don't even know how it ends. The facts of this situation seem so simple. I was really enjoying the game, and I want to experience the ending. So why does it feel so hard to just pick it back up? Every time I look over at the sizable layer of dust that's accumulated on my Switch, I wonder what it is that's preventing me from jumping back in. Today, I hope to answer that question and more. You may be shocked to learn that this is not the first time I've found myself in this situation. In fact, I'm quite sure this is a challenge that many of us face. So, a couple months ago, I set out to understand this behavior, and I had thought I'd be embarking on a philosophical exploration of gaming. Instead, my journey took me down an unexpected path, one of academic papers and controlled studies. Through this research, I actually found some compelling explanations for why this behavior may manifest in gamers. But more importantly, I discovered real strategies supported by concepts of psychology that you can use to help finish games. In this video, we'll learn how to get back into a game according to science. Before we can make sense of this reluctance to resume, we need to first look at what video games are to the human brain. In mainstream culture and media, video games are often portrayed as pure entertainment, likened to candy for the brain. But as most real gamers know, they are vastly more nuanced than that. Every game will fall somewhere on the spectrum of cognitive demand. A virtual slot machine, while technically considered a video game, will be far less taxing on the human brain than playing something like Civilization. And yet, if you asked a seasoned slots player to describe their strategies, they would probably have a lot to say about things like payout tables and percentages. Every kind of game is designed to challenge the player in some way, from learning basic controls to mastering optimal strategies. Even interpreting narrative elements and investing emotionally into the characters of a game can present our brains with tangible work. And in certain genres like strategy and puzzle games, the compute demand placed on our CPU can be pretty substantial. Now, if video games were nothing but a constant chore for our brains, well, we'd all have a different hobby. But of course, they're not. What makes games work is the beautiful balance between challenge and reward. We want to be rewarded for our precious cognition. And game designers have figured out some highly effective incentives to compensate our attention. But it turns out we don't actually need a lot to feel rewarded. Some of the most common techniques are so universal across game design that we barely register when we encounter them. Take a simple yet nearly universal mechanic, the humble quest log, for example. In sprawling open-world games like Tears of the Kingdom, quest logs can be an important tool to help the player keep track of activities that they haven't completed yet. Said another way, a quest log is basically one giant to-do list. In addition to being helpful for the player, having a to-do list built into the game is also an effective way for designers to motivate you and provide a basic sense of progress for your actions. This idea touches on one of the core principles of self-determination theory. Self-determination theory is a psychological framework that suggests all humans possess an intrinsic motivation to fulfill 3 critical psychological needs: competence, autonomy, and connectedness. As you can probably imagine, self-determination theory has a ton of implications for game design, but I'll save most of that for another video. If we think about this quest log example, it's clearly geared toward our need for competence. As you complete more of the game, the quest log shrinks, and you get the satisfaction of seeing items checked off the list. This gives the impression that progress is being made. It's visual proof of your accomplishments. And if you're able to check off one of the more challenging quests in a game, that can provide further evidence to the brain of our growing mastery of the experience. The main takeaway for now is that video games represent a delicate balance between investment and payoff, which is a concept that heavily impacts the strategies we'll be looking at later on. Games are much more than a simple dopamine rush. There is cognitive labor involved in most cases, and this labor has to be thoughtfully offset by game design elements that offer our brains a reason to engage with them. Leveraging our innate drive to get better at things, which is a facet of self-determination theory, is just one example of how designers motivate players to stick with their games. So, now that we have a bit of context as to what's going on in our heads when we engage with games, we can start to unpack what might happen when we disengage. The list of possible reasons why we stop playing games is essentially endless. I mean, life happens, we have commitments, we get distracted, and we forget. I talked a little bit about this in a previous video, but the modern gaming landscape has also played a role in my own struggle to focus on a single game and see it through to the end. So I'm not going to get into that piece right now. Just assume you have disengaged with a game that you enjoyed for some reason. It could be anything. Maybe you were having a lovely time with Octopath Traveler 2, but you got a little too cocky and decided to ignore that prompt warning you of imminent danger. Now you're stuck in an unbeatable boss battle with no option to flee, and it's been over an hour since you hit a save checkpoint. That would never happen to me, but maybe it happened to you. So you've moved on for now, but part of you still thinks about Octopath Traveler 2. Part of you may be frustrated that you've taken such a long break from it, and yet nothing changes. You continue to play other games, struggling with the thought of booting it back up. The most critical factor in a situation like this is that there was an interruption event. Something came along and broke our habit of engaging with the game. Now again, this interruption could be anything as long as it was significant enough to affect the habit we had formed. So even a seemingly harmless decision, like trying out a demo for a new game, could be the interruption that throws the train off its tracks. The event that interrupted my Tears of the Kingdom playthrough was the launch of Starfield. Now, I knew exactly when this event was coming, so in a sense I signed myself up for failure. But at the time, what I didn't know was that starting Starfield would lead me to not finishing Zelda. If I could go back, I would have made a different choice. What I discovered in my research is that getting the train back on the tracks can actually be harder for us than simply finding another train to hop onto. But why is this the case? One potential explanation takes us right back to self-determination theory. We talked about how our need to feel competent is highly relevant to how games are designed. But what happens to that sense of competence when we step away for a long time? Well, it's not quite like riding a bike. All the time we spent learning the ins and outs, getting to know the characters, the systems, training our reflexes for combat scenarios and other challenges, for most of us, that stuff doesn't get to live in our brains rent-free. When we disengage with a game, those circuits go dormant and the information begins to fade away. It starts to become more memory than active knowledge. And the longer that break is, the more we can lose. Suddenly, we're staring at an uphill battle. When we think about the idea of booting that game up again, our brains seem to push back a little. That resistance is a response to the potential loss of competence in that game, and to the energy that would be required to regain that mastery. For really competitive games like MOBAs and shooters, this effect can be even more pronounced. Because of the time commitment needed to keep up at high levels of play, it becomes extremely difficult to take extended breaks without losing your edge. So instead of running a risk like that, your brain might prefer to write the game off, choosing to see all that time invested for what it truly is, a sunk cost. By closing the door, it earns the freedom to move on to the next challenge, but without sacrificing any of the good feelings and memories associated with the time you did spend in the game. It's basically a loss aversion strategy, and I sort of get it. I think for certain kinds of gamers, this is actually their default state. They streak from one game to the next with a true economist's perspective of sunk costs. And their brains are constantly motivated to move on from that unfinished game and try something new, where the potential for upside seems like more of a guarantee. To make that even more appealing, the opening hours of most games are carefully calibrated to hook in players specifically. So even though we're technically starting from scratch, these intro sections often build some of the strongest motivation to engage because there's a very intentional sense of progression and typically more hand-holding, which shaves off some of that cognitive load. Take the Great Sky Isle from Tears of the Kingdom. This is a giant tutorial zone that introduces the player to each of Link's new abilities and gives you some simple opportunities to practice with them. I spent like 7 or 8 hours exploring the Great Sky Isle, absolutely floored at what I could do with Ultra Hand. So by the time I dove down to Hyrule, my brain was revving at peak motivation. Not only had I just learned a lot of new mechanics, satisfying my need for competence, but I also now had access to the entire open world to go play with those abilities, which satisfied my need for autonomy. Pair that with the virality of the game, seeing all of the content making its way to YouTube, the conversations happening on Reddit and Twitter, it struck that perfect self-determination theory trifecta of competence, autonomy, and connectedness. When it comes to getting back into games, SDT hits us with a double-barreled shotgun. The first slug demotivates us for fear that we've lost competence in something we've invested energy into. And the second slug tempts us into starting a new game entirely because our brains crave that opening segment experience of figuring out how things work. So what can we do about all this? While it's certainly interesting to explore the theoretical explanations for this behavior, that wasn't my main objective for this video. I wanted to learn how to prevent myself from getting into these situations with games, and I wanted to finish Tears of the Kingdom. The big question then is, how do we counteract these behavioral patterns that seem to be so deeply wired into our monkey brains? Well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that I found a handful of different techniques that can help us overwrite our native programming, and I'm going to describe 2 of those techniques in just a second. The bad news is that these strategies are closer to supplements than painkillers, which means you'll need a little bit of discipline to use them effectively. But for those of you who just want something simple and practical, I have a powerful bonus strategy at the end of the video that anyone can implement, so definitely stick around for that. One of the main challenges we discussed with taking long breaks from games is that we often lose that sense of familiarity and progress that we get when playing something habitually. So what if we had a way to help us fill in the memory gaps that form over time? Keeping a gaming journal is one really simple way to achieve this. And to get started, all you need is a pen and some paper. Or if you want to go the digital route, you can also use your phone or computer. To make this journal an effective tool, it really just needs to accomplish 2 tasks. It needs to tell you what you just did and what you want to do next. Outside of that criteria, your individual entries can be as minimal or detailed as you'd like. I'll admit that I was a little bit skeptical to try this at first because it seemed like a chore. For someone like me who is typically gaming at night, the idea of writing or typing my journal entries right before bed felt like something that could be hard to maintain. So instead of going for the written entries, I just started doing voice memos. After I log off, I pull out my phone, hit record, and just talk for a couple minutes. I describe what I accomplished during that play session, and I mention 1 or 2 things I'd like to do the next time I jump in. Here's a snippet from a recent entry that I did about Valheim. Tonight was good. I went down to the southern end of the island, the continent, whatever, and I built a new portal, make it easy to get there from my base. And then I just built a tiny little dock and a new boat so I can access all of the southern body of water, whatever it is. So yeah, for next time, I'm just gonna explore on my new boat and check out that southern body of water on my way to the second boss. So yeah, that's all it is. Just a bit of reflection and then some potential goals for the next time. Despite the old school nature of this approach, I was honestly shocked at how much easier it made jumping back into the game. It saved me from that initial period of reorientation when I had some context as to where I was and what I was on my way to do. From the psychology perspective, journaling can help us avoid that fear of losing competence by supplementing our own memory. And as an added advantage, stating our own goals out loud or on the page can further enhance that motivation to keep playing. The second strategy is one that I stumbled on by accident, but my guess is that many people have already experienced this effect, maybe without even realizing it. When Halo Infinite finally came out, I was pretty excited. But if you played this game at launch, chances are you probably didn't keep up with it for more than a couple months. Despite the solid fundamentals of Infinite, the live service strategy was a total mess. The content just wasn't there, and there were a bunch of other annoying little things that needed work. So after a few months, I just stopped playing, and that really bummed me out because I love Halo. For a lot of the competitive games out there, that probably would have been the end of the road for me. But I wasn't entirely out of the loop. I would still get emails about new seasons, and most importantly, my YouTube algorithm would suggest videos about big updates that the game was getting. One channel in particular, shout out to Mint Blitz, would post regular news and reaction videos about the game. Every so often, I would get curious and check out one of these videos. And hearing about the exciting progress that the game was making, or how much fun people were having with the new content, that exposure actually replenished my motivation to log in. So that's the second strategy. Seek out positive exposure related to the game you're trying to get back into, in whatever medium works best for you. This can also be customized depending on what kind of game it is. For multiplayer and live service games, watching competitive gameplay or following new content updates might be effective. For single-player titles, you might find it more impactful to read through fan praise on the game's subreddit, or maybe have a conversation with a friend who you know loves that game. My personal go-to method is to read or watch positive reviews of the game. These reviews remind me of many of the reasons that caused me to like the game in the first place, making it much easier to build up motivation to experience it again. The additional benefit of positive exposure seeking is it can trigger that third component of self-determination theory, our need to feel related or connected to others. Seeing other people, especially those we trust, talk positively about a game is a powerful motivator because we want to be able to connect on that experience together. All right, bonus strategy time. This one is the most crude, but also by far the easiest to implement. It's called the 2-minute rule, and it's something that James Clear outlined in his book Atomic Habits. The 2-minute rule is deceptively simple. If you're struggling to start a task, commit to doing it for just 2 minutes. This rule works wonders on the positive habits that we'd like to build in our lives, but it could just as easily be applied to video games. Sometimes the hardest part about getting back into a game isn't actually the time you'll spend relearning mechanics or sorting out the story. It's just taking the first step to start the game up again. That small amount of friction can be enough to repel us. So here's how you use the 2-minute rule to break through this barrier. Tell yourself you'll play the game for just 2 minutes. That's it. Boot up the game and commit to a couple minutes of gameplay. You can do whatever you want in those 2 minutes. It doesn't matter, as long as you make it past the title screen. After 2 minutes, the choice is yours. If it was really unpleasant to experience, then by all means, move on. But chances are, you'll keep playing for a while. That's the beauty of this strategy. By reducing your commitment to something so minimal, you effectively lower that mental barrier to entry. Once you've started, the inertia that was keeping you from the game has already lost most of its power. Before you realize, those 2 minutes will turn into an hour, and just like that, you're fully re-engaged and the train is back on the tracks. This 2-minute rule is what finally got me back into Zelda. So if you only try one strategy from this video, I hope that you'll give this one a try. In fact, let me know in the comments what game you would use the 2-minute rule on. I'd be curious to see if there are any common trends. Getting back into a game, especially one that you put on pause for a while, can feel like a daunting task. It's a situation that is all too common for gamers, and I don't see it becoming any less prevalent in the future. Thankfully, there are super smart people out there who study why humans behave the way we do and how our brain circuitry actually works. And by exploring some of these behavioral principles, like self-determination theory, we can work around them to overcome this reluctance to resume. So the next time you find yourself staring down that game you've been avoiding, try to remember these strategies, whether it's journaling to keep your progress and goals on track, seeking out positive exposure to boost your excitement for a game, or just committing to a quick 2 minutes of gameplay. There's always a way to get the train back on the tracks. The last point I'll make is that while each of these strategies can be effective on their own, combining them together will yield the strongest results. Starting with the 2-minute rule will get you over that initial obstacle, but if you also build in a journaling habit and regular positive exposure, that will be a hard game to put down. This combo approach is the one I've ultimately adopted, and I couldn't be happier. At this point, I can confirm that these aren't just theories, they're practical steps that have fundamentally transformed my gaming habits, and I believe they can do the same for you. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful or insightful, leaving a like or comment will really help my small channel grow. And if you're interested to see more videos like this in the future, consider subscribing to the channel. I would love to have you on board. Take care, y'all.